to Mind Escape. Are you ready?
Are you ready to escape your mind?
Hello, Mind Escapees. If you have not already, please go check out my other channel, Masters of Rhetoric. I will have the link down below. It's also part of the Mind Escape LinkTree link. It's something I'm very passionate about, where I dissect the origins of Western thought through the pre-Socratic thinkers, all the way to Aristotle, and I'm probably going to go beyond that as well at some point. So please support Masters of Rhetoric. Go check out our YouTube channel and subscribe. There's tons of shorts on there already, as well as episodes. And there's a bunch of episodes lined up. I'm on all audio platforms with it. And if you're on TikTok, Instagram, X, or any of the social media platforms, please go check out our page on there as well. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you. Tonight I have an amazing episode for everybody. I am joined by author, researcher, and friend PD Newman. We're going to be discussing his latest book, Tripping the Trail of Ghosts. Also, if you have not already, check out his previous books. I have the links down below. Alchemically Stoned, Angels in Vermilion, and Theurgy, Theory and Practice. I've had PD on more than probably most other guests, maybe even 8 or 9 times. And each time it's a fascinating conversation. He does his homework. He does his research. He's very well versed. He reads probably more than most other people in the world. He's very well versed. And if you're looking for some sort of esoteric book on a topic, check out his social media, because he might even be selling one of his books that he's already read through. So sit back, relax, and get ready to trip the trail of ghosts with me and PD. All right, welcome back on Mind Escape. Danny, how are you?
Doing good. Good.
Yeah, it's
Good to
been a
see you.
bit. Yeah. I know we've been trying to do this for a while, since your book, Tripping the Trail of Ghosts, came out. And it's obviously something we've talked about in the past. I know I've had you and Greg Little on at the same time, and we've talked about some of the stuff. And you've mentioned your Missihuasca Hypothesis a few times, but I thought we'd kind of go through it a little bit deeper. And yeah, I really appreciate you doing this.
My pleasure.
So just to jump right in, what was the catalyst for you to start writing this book, other than obviously the Missihuasca Hypothesis?
Well, the hypothesis came much later. When I started looking into the material, it was a result of my previous book on theurgy, and theurgy is a late antique uh, ritualistic application of Platonic metaphysics. And it's essentially a model of soul ascent. And there are envisaged 2 portals in the heavens, one where disincarnate entities exit the realm of material, and one where pre-incarnate beings enter to incarnate. And I was at a conference in Yorkshire, fantastic conference called the Tyringham Initiative. And Brian Murarescu, who wrote The Immortality Key, I know you know him, but he was there and he was asking, what was I up to? And I had just published Theurgy, and I knew he had a background in classics. And so I'm describing to him the model of theurgic ascent. And nearby to us were Dennis McKenna and Graham Hancock, and they were talking amongst themselves, just like Brian and I were. But they had overheard our conversation, and Graham turns around and says, "Oh, you're talking about the path of souls." And I said, I've never heard that. I don't know what that is. I'm talking about theurgy." And I said, "Is that what some people call this ascent model in theurgy. He said, "Oh no, it's a Native American model of soul ascent, but it's exactly what you're describing with two portals in the sky and you know accessing the one for discarnate entities in order to step foot on the Milky Way, which is the path of souls proper." And this is what piqued my interest. Beyond, I had participated in some smoke and sweat ceremonies with some Lakota natives in Memphis in the past, but that was about the extent of my knowledge of anything regarding Native American spirituality. And so I jumped on my phone and started researching Path of Souls, and the first thing that came up was Greg Little's book, The Path of Souls. And so I ordered it. By the time I got back to Mississippi, the book was waiting for me. And I was the first thing that struck me was the fact that Greg lived in Memphis, which is about an hour drive. That's where I was born. Like, so I was thinking, what are the odds that this guy's this close to me? Um, so I contacted him. We met up. He showed me around some mounds in Memphis that I wasn't aware of, and from there, I used the sources mentioned in his book, particularly the ones that centered around F. Kent Riley's annual or biannual conference he would have at Texas University, where he would invite academics, both archaeologists, anthropologists, as well as natives, Native Americans, to come and try and make sense of the iconography and what was previously known as the Southern Death Cult. But now that term is out of vogue, it's seen as offensive. Um, so those texts were, which turned out to be the source texts for this approach to studying the iconography, I just began devouring them. And there aren't many. I think in all there are 4 or 5 source books before we get into secondary literature within this domain. But the more I read, not only was I completely taken aback by the parallels between that model and theurgy, because there was no known communication among these groups. I was struck by the repeated reference to um, plants that were discovered within the vicinity of these mound complexes when they would do analyses of botanical assemblages. They'd rake up soil and look for pollen and plant remains and seeds. And pretty much in every case, if it wasn't the remains of a foodstuff, it was psychoactive or outright hallucinogenic. And so that's what really, you know, made me feel like there's enough here, there's enough to contribute and warrant a new book, a new study in this domain, but focusing instead not just on the path of souls, not just on psychedelics, but how those two were bridged through the use of ritual that took place on these mound complexes. And once that approach became my kind of north star, um, I started looking at the complexes themselves in a whole different way, because there were so many parallels between them and the Path of Souls itself. So I began to develop this understanding that the mound complexes served as a sort of virtual training ground for living persons being taught this information. Because just like with, in ancient Egypt, um, originally only the pharaohs were the ones that were, because the same model exists in Egypt. Only the pharaohs were the ones that were doing this. Um, but by the time the Pyramid of Unas was discovered and the hieroglyphs on the walls were copied, that's where we get the pyramid texts. After that came this tradition of what are known as the coffin texts, where this same information or a variation of it would be painted on the inside of a coffin for the deceased, and then eventually with the widespread distribution of papyrus, we get into a time when virtually anybody who could afford it could have their own personal Book of the Dead, like the Papyrus of Ani that we currently call the Egyptian Book of the Dead. But there aren't one. There are many of these. Um, so just like in that case, in the Native American model, this was secret wisdom that was only available to the chiefs, the elite, the shamans. But eventually, these sodalities, these secret societies, were formed that we might call a society of shamans, where this wisdom was imparted incrementally in the form of a formal degree structure, so that they could teach persons while they're alive the necessary steps to take once they die, how to get on the path of souls. Um, yeah, that's how it came about, and how the Missihuasca hypothesis it just emerged organically from this territory, especially once I saw the prevalence of honey locust in the ethnographies, and eventually started getting familiar with it where I could recognize it in the archaeology. But honey locust is a native source of NN-DMT that grows all around the South, and it was intentionally propagated by the Cherokee, so much so that um, the animals that used to feed on honey locust and distribute the seeds through feeding on them are extinct. There's nothing left that still feeds on the honey locust. Now, you'll still see things like foxes that will eat the seeds, but not in the amounts that would warrant the wide dispersal we see, particularly around sites the Cherokee inhabited. So this has led botanists to conclude that it was being intentionally propagated, but they were unable to come to an agreement as to why they were being propagated. And this seemed to me to be the uh, most logical reason for that.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you for the summary there to set this up.
Hmm.
I remember you reaching out because Greg Little, somebody that we've had on the show a ton. He's actually in our um, As Within So Without documentary, as are you, um, both sharing knowledge and stories. But you reached out to me and said, "Hey, can you put me in contact with Greg Little?" I said, "Yeah, no problem. Of course." I kind of had an idea of what was going on, and I had talked with Greg in the past, which he was kind of, a little bit. Um, Hesitant to talk about his knowledge of psychoactive compounds and his history with all that. But I think since you've connected with him, he's definitely been more open about it. And as you can see on X, he's definitely posting a lot about the effigy pipes and things like that now. And he's a great follow on X if you don't already. And he's the author of the Encyclopedia of Native American Mounds, which I highly recommend if you're interested in that topic. But what I found interesting too is you had Christine Van Poel write the foreword to your book. How did you connect with her, and what did you feel like she brought to this hypothesis?
Well, in addition to F. Kent Riley, another major figure in this research was a guy named George E. Langford. And he recently passed away. I believe he was living in Alabama. Um, but he did so much for the preservation of the folklore of the Mississippians. And in one of his papers that was published in a journal that is owned by uh, archaeologists in Arkansas, there's a series of them. I think there are three in all. But he discusses the significance, the relevance of these noted pots, and they're pottery, but they're covered in little nodes that stick out all over them. And he discusses the probability that these are in reference to datura seed pods. And the thing with the Mississippians is they didn't have a universal system of writing. The Ojibwa did, they had writing, but it wasn't universal. So let's say that they would write on these birch bark scrolls. Let's say that you got your hands on one of these scrolls. Even if you were a native Ojibwa, you wouldn't be able to read it without asking the person who wrote it, what does this mean? So they had a system of symbols, but they weren't universal. In many cases, unique symbols were used that without access to the author, you'd never know what it said. So by and large, for the most part, there was no writing within the Mississippian tradition. So how do you um, how do you preserve certain sensitive concoctions, potions, substances alongside foodstuffs, especially with children running around? How do you preserve it and label it at the same time to let everyone know this is something that will cause you to hallucinate or potentially die if you take too much of it? And their solution was pretty brilliant, in my opinion. They would construct them either to resemble the things they contained or to resemble the supernatural entity that they believed the substance would either put you in touch with or protect you from. So that with these noted pots, and they were tested by um, Eric Singleton and several other folks tested a number of pots they found at Spiro in Oklahoma, and they tested positive for datura residues. So that was a good confirmation of Langford's theory that these noted pots were indeed intended to resemble datura seed pods. Now, in that study, he cites Christine Van Poel, saying that she's really the pioneer in this territory. She was the first one to propose something like this. So I looked into her work, and sure enough, years prior to Langford's work, she and her colleagues had been identifying noted pots, not in the southeast, what I'm studying, but in the southwest, and with the proposal that these resemble datura seed pods. And so I got in touch with her and kind of ran my hypothesis, including the Missihuasca hypothesis, by her. Um, and she was incredibly receptive and also incredibly supportive. And gave me notes, it gave pointed me in very helpful directions. And so it was fairly natural, once the book was done. She was who ideally I wanted to write the foreword, and I was happily elated when she said she would, and she did a great job. She's a phenomenal, absolutely brilliant scholar in this domain.
Awesome. Yeah. No, sometimes forwards, it's like somebody's just giving their endorsement or whatever, but I think she definitely added and helped set up kind of what you were going into there. So, yeah, I appreciated that. Um, in your introduction, you start talking about the MIIS Ipians. Can you elaborate on that, and what does that even mean?
Yeah, yeah. So like I said, the Southern Death Cult uh, name applied to this iconography really fell out of favor, especially following the conferences that were being held at Texas University. And the participants struggled to find a new way to identify these and an acceptable name. And the first one that they settled on was the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, something like that. And that seemed fitting for a while, but eventually the need arose for something more specific. And there was another term um, that escapes me. I believe the initials are MACC, uh, Mississippian artifact or something in that area. But finally, the last name, the last designation that was settled upon was the MIIS, which is the Mississippian Ideological Interaction Sphere. Um, and this became important because it's fallacious to think of the Mississippians as one big culture. It's a conglomeration of different tribes that each have, very different life ways, very different mythologies, and of course, just like we see with neighboring groups all over the world, there's some crossover, but even where that crossover occurs, from the academic standpoint, it's important to maintain a distinction between them and recognize this is just crossover and um, not an indication that this is the same group or came from a previous similar group. So interaction sphere allowed an approach to the problem of a group of different cultures interacting through shared iconography, even when over distance and throughout time, the meanings attributed to that iconography might change, just like with anything else, and it's a cliche, but it's still hold. In some ways, it's kind of like the telephone game. Over time, uh, the intention can be to perpetuate something that the speaker believes was also ascribed to by his distant ancestors. But naturally, these things change with the time. New technologies come along. Just like with, I'm sure you're familiar with Joshua Cutchin's work and Jacques Vallée, where they're looking at the language used throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance to describe beings, which, because we're a technological society, in many cases, we might be describing the same things, but naturally we're going to opt for a technological language to explain it, like extraterrestrials or interdimensional beings. Whereas, prior to um, the emergence of quantum physics, another dimension wasn't really language they would have had access to. So just by us, that being our fallback, we naturally explain it in a different way. And this is true also for the Mississippians. By the time, especially by the time the colonists got here, and they're introducing things like gunpowder and distilled whiskeys, things like that. It naturally, once those things become incorporated, become commonplace, it becomes the best way that the next generation can explain certain phenomena. So we see that within the interaction sphere, and by calling it the interaction sphere, it allows for those small variations and allows for them to receive the reverence and the respect that they deserve without some outsider coming along and saying, "Oh, you're just like them," when they would never say that.
Interesting. Yeah, you mentioned entities. So, like, how did your thinking evolve from ghost as an apparition or classical understanding of it to more of like ghost as a ritual technology?
What do you mean in terms of the path of souls itself?
Yeah, in terms of like this realm of understanding with the psychedelics and the Native Americans and things like that.
Well, you know, to be 100% fair, I'm probably just as guilty of the same problem, because I do come from a background in the use of entheogens and in encounters with beings that one person, a contactee or an abductee, might say, "Oh, that's an alien," or somebody that's into paranormal research might say, "Oh, that's a ghost." For me, especially in the early stages of my research, before I really um, surrendered to a magical worldview, which was a gradual process, for me, it was psychological. I came from a background studying Jung and Spielrein and Rank and Freud. Um, so for me, my experience with those substances was very much limited to what I believed was coming from my own psyche, unconscious or projection. Um, so in that way, I'm probably guilty of the same. But at the same time, even though I'm not an academic and have no desire to work in academia, for scholarship to be acceptable, there is a certain way phenomena have to be treated, but without it being outright dismissed. Now that's gradually changing with people like um, Kripal. I think it's Kripal.
Yeah,
Um,
Jeffrey Kripal.
yeah, he's doing a lot, as are many others. But he's key, I think, in this transition to where we can approach this stuff phenomenologically and not reductively. And my future work, I'm really going to make more of an effort to see things, or at least communicate things that way, because I do see them that way. But like I said, from a scholarship perspective, there is an apprehension and to be honest, a phobia inherent in communicating this stuff in that way. Anthropologists, they really have the benefit, in that regard, because if they're going to describe the material faithfully, even if they don't believe it phenomenologically, they still discuss it that way. And I'm trying to take some pages from their book, and incorporate that into the way I express these ideas. So we'll see how that goes. But in my future work, that's definitely a big concern for me.
Yeah, I mean, we all want to get stuff right as human beings, right? Or as long as you're, an honest person, right? There's a lot of people out there grifting and, doing not so great stuff. But the people that are doing the work, putting in the time, doing the real research, you want to get it right and you want it to be taken seriously. We're all humans in that sense that we're flawed and we've got cognitive bias and apophenia, pareidolia, all these kinds of things. So it is kind of like a tightrope walk in that regard when you look at these topics, like the fringe topics and things like that, and just metaphysics and stuff like psychedelics and psychoactive compounds, just stuff we don't know a ton about yet scientifically because it's kind of still like on the forefront of cutting edge research. So yeah, no, I appreciate that approach, and I think that's what makes you a great author too, is you're not like, oh, this is how it is, and this is a definitive take on things. I don't like that, and I don't think that people respond to that well either, and it doesn't age well usually as well. So
Mhm.
what psychoactive compound candidates surprised you most in terms of its like ritual sophistication while you were writing this book?
Absolutely, the Missihuasca hypothesis, and granted, it is a hypothesis. We don't have any conclusive findings of, like, we have datura residues. We don't have DMT residues. Um, and of course we wouldn't. That particular molecule um, wouldn't survive in the way that the datura scopolamine, that stuff can survive longer. Not to mention the fact that virtually everything has some amount of DMT in it. It's almost in everything. So even if we did find it, depending on where it was found, what the conditions were, it still might not be conclusive evidence. But the best evidence for me was in the domain of archaeology and the ethnographies, and it was surprising because we've always been told that ayahuasca was a phenomenon unique to South America, that no one else was doing this. And you're familiar with my previous research with DMT and acacia and the roles that that played in alchemy and Freemasonry. Um, so I was already open to the idea that DMT did have a prehistory that most people weren't aware of, simply because nobody is really looking at the problem in that way. But that doesn't finding DMT is not finding ayahuasca. And the math was done, um, and I'm sure it would be different now because new species have been discovered. But at the time, taking into account all of the plants that were native and growing in the Amazon, in the Amazon basin, the odds of finding the two that would produce the effect that ayahuasca does were astronomical. It was considered an impossible feat, and yet it happened. And since those estimates were arrived at, we now know that there were more than two. While there is only the one good source of monoamine oxidase inhibitor, the Banisteriopsis copy vine. There are numerous DMT containing plants. The most common is the Psychotria viridis, but there's Diplopterus cabrerana, and there's a species of Virola that Dennis McKenna studied, among others. So that raises the odds that it would be discovered, but even by raising them, it's still pretty phenomenal that it happened, that they found it. So the idea that ayahuasca it would be being used in North America and the Southeast, you know, it was pretty mind blowing for me. It was paradigm shifting because we're not talking about importing true ayahuasca from the Amazon basin. Um, we're talking about a discovery of two plants that are completely different from the plants that they have access to down there, that there is evidence that they're being combined to produce a chemically, phenomenologically similar concoction. So huge paradigm shift. And the plants that they're using, the way I arrived at this conclusion, it started with the botanical assemblages, because in dozens of them, I'm seeing Passiflora incarnata show up, which is our native passion flower here. And there are several species of passion flower, but only two of them are known to contain monoamine oxidase inhibitors. They contain harmine. Ours is one of them. And for the past 20 years, that's my source that I use for potentiating tryptamines. I'll take about 10 to 25 grams, depending on what part of the plant I'm using, to potentiate mushrooms or NN-DMT. And it works with mushrooms because psilocin and psilocybin are both forms of NN-DMT. Psilocybin is for hydroxy NN-DMT, and psilocin is for phosphoryloxy NN-DMT. And so harmine and other MAOIs interact with it in very much the same way, increases and prolongs the effects, also alters them in some ways. But I'm seeing this, and that really got me interested. And what made me first begin to suspect there might be something going on with the MAOIs were the sketches of the Mississippians drinking out of these giant whelk shell cups. Because in the depictions, they're drinking it and vomiting. And traditionally, what is in the literature is that what they're drinking from these cups is something we call black drink. I think in in Florida, among the Florida natives, it was known as cassina, but it's made from Ilex vomitoria, and it was given that name vomitoria by the botanist because they would observe these natives drink it and vomit and drink it again and vomit. So it was assumed it was an emetic. Well, what Ilex vomitoria is Yaupon holly, and it only grows in North Mississippi, some parts of southern Tennessee, northern Georgia, and on over into northern Florida. But what they would do is boil up a concoction of this stuff, um, and reduce it, make it so concentrated that it essentially became like a black syrup. And fast forward to colonial times, before coffee was being imported to the States, to the colonies, the way people were getting their morning jolt, after they realized drinking rum in the morning wasn't the most productive uh, way to start your day, they started making tea from these leaves. You roast them to decarboxylate them, which activates the caffeine in them. They're the only native source of caffeine in North America. And so I'm wondering, how are these colonists drinking it to start their day if it's an emetic, if it's a purgative and makes you vomit? And so just like with anything else in my research, I'm a big take it to the bench, like JBS Haldane, test it on yourself and see what it does. And we had it growing all around our pond in the yard here. So I collected up all of these leaves, washed them, dried them, and then roasted them, ground them into a powder, and started making tea from it. And I started slow, um, and nothing happened outside of caffeine buzz. So I'd increase the dose, I'd increase the concentration. And at one point, I even made a gallon of this stuff and reduced it down to about 10 ounces of liquid. It tasted, unbearable, but I didn't vomit. And I never even got so much as nauseous. So that's when I said, well, there's something else going on. What are they drinking that's making them vomit? If it's this, that's not a solution. And it was around the same time that I read Sean Rafferty's book on Native American intoxicants. And he notes that depending on the occasion for drinking this black drink, the additives would change, and these additives were oftentimes secret, that they were only known to the groups drinking them for the purpose they were drinking it. And you know as well as I do the association with purging in ayahuasca. It's even called la purga in some regions because it makes you vomit or come out the other end, but it makes you purge. And so at that time, it was just a kind of a novel suspicion, like, like a what if they were consuming a form of ayahuasca? Um, and so I keep digging, and I find out that the Ilex vomitoria is a close cousin of yerba mate in South America, which contains monoamine oxidase inhibitors, contains beta carbolines. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Now we know that what they're drinking would potentiate it if it were concentrated enough. And then I find out that the tobacco they're using, Nicotiana rustica, contains monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So there are three potential plants, all of which many of these tribes are using for different reasons, that were they combined with the source of DMT, it would cause an ayahuasca-like experience. And so I started going back through the literature, um, looking for a tree or another type of plant. But first, I was looking for a tree, largely because of my previous research into acacia, for a tree here that would meet that criteria. And I found it in none of the academic sources. The only place I found it was in a book called Some Simple Tryptamines by Keeper of the Trout, which is a classic in psychedelic literature. But he had um, tested the roots of a honey locust tree and found that they contained NN-DMT in them, which isn't surprising. Honey locust, now it's classified as Gleditsia triacanthos, but prior to that reclassification, it was known as Acacia americana. And we know that there are hundreds of species of acacia that contain DMT either in the roots, in the leaves, in the flowers, and the external bark. But just like with the Gerima preta, the Mimosa hostilis, which was previously Acacia tenuiflora in South America, with Cletidsia triacanthus, it's in the roots, and that became my focus for the next several months, trying to find any evidence that this would have been used. And the evidence came when I was reading the work of James Mooney. And James Mooney was a very important figure also in Southeastern ethnographies. He was a big proponent, big supporter of the natives' rights to use peyote when their peyote ceremonies were trying to be shut down by the U.S. government. Um, he was a major figure in making sure that didn't happen. Well, he also did some work in the southeastern territories for the Smithsonian. And in the Smithsonian's publication of the myths of the Cherokee, I found my smoking gun. I mean, he- they would use it. What he first notes about it is that they would use it in their ball games. The Cherokee have a kind of lacrosse like ball game that they would play, and the sticks would be made from a honey locust that had been struck by lightning. That was my first reference, and I thought, well, that's not proof that they're consuming it, but we know it's sacred to them. And then he goes on to say that when they play, they take the ash from where it was struck by lightning and they draw crosses on their shoulders, and then they take the roots and chew on them while they play. And now chewing the roots, because there's no beta carbolines, no monoamine oxidase inhibitor in the plant, it's doubtful that that would cause any kind of effect. But remember, they are also smoking tobacco that has monoamine oxidase inhibitors in it. They're also drinking black drink before these games that has monoamine oxidase inhibitors. And they were in the habit of spitting the juices out and rubbing it on their bodies. And I'm sure you're familiar with Terence McKenna's book, True Hallucinations, where he goes to La Chorrera looking for ukuhe, this orally active DMT that doesn't have a monoamine oxidase inhibitor in it. And in searching for that, he meets a shaman that explains to them that it's also used in warfare, that if one shaman is battling another, they'll sneak to his house and rub ukuhe on the rungs of the ladder that they used to climb up on the top of their house to do certain ceremonies. So that once they get up there, the ukuhe, the DMT, will soak into their hands, cause them to become off balance. They'll fall off the house and die or be injured. So it was a form of warfare and a good indication that it is transdermally absorbable, even without a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. So that was exciting, but we still hadn't arrived at anything specifically like an ayahuasca resembling concoction. And in the same text, it gets into the myths. Now, in the tribes of the southeast, there's a prevalent myth of these two twins. They call them the hero twins. One of them was raised by the father. The other one was thrown away, and why he was thrown away changes with the tribes. But the most common variation is that the father's gone hunting, the mother is pregnant with twins. This evil being, this underground being, comes and mauls her and kills her. The father comes home and finds her dead, but he can see that there's movement in her womb. And so he cuts the womb open and takes the baby, not realizing there are two babies in there. And he throws the remains into a nearby pool. So the second baby um, gets kind of adopted by these same the emissaries of this same below world being that killed the mother, and he gets raised in the below world, and because of this he knows magic. He's learned magic from them. So while Lodge Boy, the first boy, he's raised in a political kind of a setting where he's raised to be a leader. Thrown Away is raised to be a magician, and he's wild, whereas the other is civilized. So in this story, um, the wild one approaches his father's hut, and this story, this likely served as what's known as a charter, um, to explain actual rites of passage that young boys would have gone through. So the myth becomes it begins to inform the ritual itself. The boys are playing the role of Thrown Away in this rite of passage, becoming recognized as the child of this father. So the boy approaches the father's hut and tells him, "I'm your son." And the father says, "Well, that remains to be seen. We'll have to do some tests to find out." He says, "Until we get ready, have a seat right over here." And this is the first test. And it's blankets on the ground. Unbeknownst to him, beneath those blankets are thorns from the honey locust tree. And honey locust thorns, they can get 12 to 14 inches long. They're huge, long thorns, extremely sharp. And he sits down and it doesn't harm him. And so that's taken as there's three tests, very classic Van Gennep rite of passage, and it doesn't harm him. So once it doesn't harm him, the father says, "Okay, let me see how will you fare playing stickball against my other sons," because by this part he's got more sons. And the mother pulls him aside, the new wife, and she whispers to him that they're going to cheat. In another version, she tells him that you can't win. You're one against many. And she says, "You have the power of lightning. If you strike lightning at or in the direction of your father's honey locust tree, he'll immediately stop the game because he doesn't want to lose that tree." And so he goes out, they start playing stickball, and he strikes lightning at the tree. Just like she said, the father says, "Nope, stop. This ain't happening. You ain't killing my honey locust tree." And he brings him in for the third and final test. And this is the one that really opened the possibility of an ayahuasca analog in the Southeast. Um, he has the boy climb into a giant cauldron, a giant pot. And in the pot with him are the roots of the honey locust tree. Remember, the roots are where the molecule is located. And he's boiled in this pot. And if it doesn't kill him, that's the final proof that he's this immortal godlike being that is really the twin of Lodge Boy. So there are artifacts that back this up, and one example is a gorget that they'd carve from shells, the same whelk shells they would drink this substance out of. And in the gorget, archaeologists were dumbfounded as to what it represented because it shows a humanoid figure in a definite circle, um, a two-edged circle, so a lip, a rim, and he's surrounded by all these squiggly, curly lines. And archaeologists never knew what this was, so they gave them the name the spaghetti-style gorgets or gorgets because they look like they have spaghetti noodles in them. But after reading that description from Mooney, I thought, could that be the boy in the pot with these roots? And so I started digging on any description of this gorget and finally come across this paper by F. Kent Riley where he draws it not from an aerial perspective, but 3D and says this is a depiction of a humanoid figure in a boiling pot. We don't know what the curly lines are, but it's somebody in a pot being boiled. And that for me, I said, well, there, let's keep pushing, let's keep digging. um and it was out of that I really began to entertain the possibility and got the nerve to put it in writing that I think this could be what's going on. And Christine Van Poel invited me to the Society of American Archaeologists conference in New Orleans and asked me to present this material. And I was very nervous because I was the only person there that didn't have a PhD or wasn't studying to get his PhD. I felt like I didn't really, I had, imposter syndrome all over me going into this place. Um, so I presented the material with a lot of conditionals, a lot of if, then, or maybe, perhaps. But afterwards, it was overwhelmingly well received. And I even had one very prominent scholar in this field come and tell me, "Look, you can remove the conditionals." He said, This is the closest we've got to a solution to what's going on with the gorgets, with these particular ethnographies, with why these plants were so revered, this particular tree." And so it was very well received. And since then, we've gotten even more confirmation. And this came from Greg Little. He likes to post on his Twitter feed, his X feed, um, pots and mounds and gorgets. But he posted a picture of a clay pot I had never seen, um, and it was a pot with a humanoid figure inside of it, just like the gorget, but it comes from a different tribe. So this is a good example of how they can have the same icon, but the description and the execution of it will change, but very likely indicative of the same myth or a variation thereof. So yeah, that was by far the most shocking, and I think paradigm shifting, not just for me, but for the whole study of what was going on with the Path of Souls, with the southeastern natives and all of those tribes involved in it.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I mean, it makes sense. Your research isn't um, predicated on, you know, like you said, you actually try these compounds, you try to recreate these scenarios. So, um, yeah, I mean, I think that that's what's missing from a lot of other people's research too, is taking it from the hypothetical or a hypothesis to actually a theory or trying to test the hypothesis or something like that. So I think that that's just another reason why I appreciate your work is you're willing to put yourself out there and you're honest with yourself. Like, hey, I don't know if this is true, but let me, put it out there and see what actual academics have to say about it. So, no, that's awesome. In chapter 2, Cavern of Sacred Visions, what makes a cave more than just geology or a place? Like, what makes it a machine or something transformative?
That's a good question. Um, when you look at the origin myths of a number of different uh, tribes and groups in the Southeast, you see caves. Um, Here in Mississippi, the Choctaw, the band of Choctaws, recently reacquired the land whereon their sacred cave exists. And their origin myth is that their people formed within a mound, Naniwe, a mound, like a big belly, but then emerged from a cave. So you see this anthropomorphization of the earth as womb and vulva, and from this, the people are born like babies. And when you're looking at the Mississippian iconography that's so prevalent in the Southeast, the Mississippians proper only go back to about 1000 AD, whereas the iconography itself shows up much earlier in a place called Picture Cave. And Picture Cave is located at a secret location on private land in Missouri. And within it, there are something like 300 petroglyphs that are that predate that 1000 AD dating for the origin of the Mississippians. And it's where we're first introduced to a number of these supernatural figures like Redhorn and uh, the underwater panther and the great serpent, the horned serpent, and they show up in there. And recent dating of some of the petroglyphs in there, I don't want to give away the material because the paper I don't think has been published yet, but it shows a much earlier date than what has been imagined for the Mississippians. So that cave, just like with the Naniwea cave for the Choctaw, it's sort of the birthplace of the Mississippians. It's where we see the earliest examples of the iconography that defines them. Um, and caves, they've always been sought out in regions where they exist by those seeking visions, by shamans, by people undergoing rites of passage. And it's akin to what John C. Lilly was doing with his float tanks, because you can't hear anything once you're deep in there. You can't see anything once you're in the dark zone. So it effectively becomes a sensory deprivation tank. And through trance induction techniques, through fasting, through physical tortures, scarification, and through the consumption of entheogenic or psychoactive plants, the the effects of that isolation can bring about intense visionary experiences. And that's likely what was taking place in Picture Cave. uh, and the natives that visited this were from all over. Some of them would travel 1,000 miles to get to this cave, and the time span is also great. So it's very possible that that it had a number of different uses. I imagine, and this is just speculation, but I imagine that the early uses probably were that sensory deprivation model, and whatever visions were seen emerging from the walls of this cave, just like is proposed with Neanderthal art and caves in France. It's been proposed that what they saw, they then immortalized by painting or etching or, depicting on the spot where they saw it. Now, over time, the cave, once pictures are there, I think it's a natural evolution that others will come in and add to the art. And the art, we live in a time when all of these different domains have been separated, demarcated. We don't think about religion as being art or medicine as being magic. All these things are separated. But for indigenous cultures, that's not the case. Everything is sacred, everything participates in the sacred. Religion as such doesn't exist because everything is a religious activity for them. The secular does not exist. So once art has been um, left on these walls of this cave for whatever reason, it's only a natural next step for other art to be added. And I think the, and again, I'm speculating, but I think what probably took place is because what's being depicted isn't everyday activities, it's supernatural beings from their own mythology. It opened up the door for kind of a prototypical television, in a way, where images can be shown one at a time to deliver a narrative to a candidate, to an initiate that's coming there to be initiated into this secret supernatural wisdom that was shared by a number of tribes, because it wasn't just one tribe using it, it's all different tribes. And that speaks also to the the unifying element of it, because raiding was a real it was reality for a number of tribes. You raided other tribes, and how well you raided them was largely how much of a man you were considered, how much honor you had was based on your success at raiding other villages. So I think it's a testimony to uh, the cave and to the natives themselves that this place transcended that. That once they were there, the differences didn't matter. A lot like in a Masonic lodge, you might have Jews and Muslims battling in war right now, but the minute they step into a lodge, that's gone. You saw that in the Civil War, where a man who was a Mason in the North coming down to the South, he'd encounter a Confederate Mason, and there are stories, I've heard numerous stories, where they say, "Don't touch him, don't touch his family, don't touch his house. That's my brother." You know, so the differences, just like with those scenarios within this cave, the differences fell away, and it became this magical theater, really like a television. Because once you get in the dark zones where the art exists, you can't see, and their only method of seeing would have been with a torch, and with a torch, the light doesn't go very far. They would have been able to illuminate one icon at a time. So they would have been presented sequentially, which would naturally lend itself to a narrative. And I think this is probably where a lot of the narratives emerged from for a number of different tribes. Even though again they change over space, they change over time, but it does become this magic time capsule where something resembling theater or television is made possible. And I'll get a little bit out there with this because I do think it's pertinent. But David Lewis Williams, an archaeologist that was studying the rock art of the Sand People, he developed this model of trance. He calls it the three stages of trance model. And he postulates that the first stage of trance is the perception of geometric figures, geometric motifs, a set number of them that a chemist named Heinrich Kluver discovered. He calls them form constants. He discovered them taking mescaline in his laboratory with his assistant. But these appear over and over in the earliest cave art and Neanderthal art. Lattices, spirals, funnels or tunnels, and cobwebs are the traditional forms. So he postulates that in stage one of trance, you're seeing geometric figures. In stage two of trance, um, these geometric figures begin to take on the appearance, often three-dimensionally, um, of real world objects that those shapes and form. So let's say it's a lattice work of hexagons. Um, Once you enter stage two, that might become a honeycomb for if and it's often culturally relevant. So especially if the individual was a beekeeper, he would probably see something like honeycombs. If they were from Ireland, they might begin to see the basalt columns, that form the long hexagonal structures that piece together like a honeycomb. But they're still observing it as an outsider. They're watching it like we watch TV. When stage three happens, the fourth wall falls, like in theater. In theater, the actors don't address the audience. There's a invisible fourth wall that separates the two, and never shall the twain meet. But that the fourth wall falls away, and they become an active participant in what they're observing, oftentimes without remembering that they ever took a drug, which is, you've probably heard or experienced something similar with high doses of psilocybin. You get immersed into this almost alien narrative, and you forget who you are, that you've done a drug, and you're totally in what's happening. And so that's what happens with stage three. So with these caves, um, just like with television or a play, a theater, a group of people watching television are essentially participating in a version of stage two trance. You know, the first time we get to something like stage three on a global level is when something like Nintendo emerges. You know, because then you're even though you have an avatar on the screen, you are him. You know, and you're participating in the drama that's going on, controlling the direction it moves. So with these caves, I think it's something a lot like that. In the stages where someone is being taught this myth through this narrative, it's very much an artificial induction of stage two trance. But the moment someone descends into this cave with the intention of inducing trance through one or more of these techniques, they participate in it. You know, they're participating in the being, the entity that they're observing on the walls, probably in some cases becoming them. But that wouldn't have been confusing for them, especially with rites of passage and rituals, initiations that are based on the myths already, where they're playing the character. And again, to bring it to something modern, like in Masonry, where the candidate is made to be Hiram Abiff and he's murdered and raised. Um, you know, in those moments, it's bewildering, because you're no longer observing a mystery play. You're at the center of it and had no idea you were going to be at the center of it. Um, and I think that can tell us a lot about, you know, you use the phrase machine. Is that what how can it be like a machine? I think that's how. I think that's the closest thing to how to view it as a technology and not just a dwelling place or a shelter, if that makes sense.
No, I appreciate that. Yeah, no, that was a good explanation. And if you look throughout history, you know, Da Vinci disappearing in a cave, and a lot of great artists and minds of similar things, or, you know, darkness induced visions and things of that nature. So, super interesting. Um, do you think the Cahokia mound alignments were some sort of like astronomical launch window for spiritual contact during um, these psychedelic rituals, or what do you think was happening there?
Absolutely, I think most of them were, but Cahokia is really easy to see, um, because the structure of the complex lines up perfectly with the constellation we recognize as Orion. And that's confusing for a lot of people studying this because, you know, they're well aware of the fact that Orion is a Greek convention and they wouldn't have recognized that cluster of stars that way. And that's true. The same cluster is still sacred to them, but they see it as the chief's hand constellation. And it appears that the oldest mounds are the ones that align with the chief's hand constellation. The other ones that seem to resemble what we see as Orion are significantly later, and it appears to be that they weren't so much trying to create Orion on the ground as much as they were including the other stars around the constellation, and the ones that stand out the most, that seem to form a shape, are those that they include there. And it also is interesting that when you look at the depiction of Redhorn in Picture Cave, it fits. If you overlay that on Orion, you're looking at a perfect match, you know. So there does seem to be a tradition of seeing it as a humanoid figure, even though you know, it would be incredibly misleading to say it's Orion, it's the hunter that they're creating. But they were certainly modeling it after that. And the reason they would want to model it around that specific constellation is because in the palm of the chief's hand, one of the most prevalent pieces of iconography from the Mississippian ideological interaction sphere is a hand that looks like it has an eye in the palm. Um, it's not an eye. It's actually meant to look like what they call the Megis shell, which is a cowrie shell. Actually, I have one right here. These little shells, and these are sacred um, among a number of tribes and medicine sodalities, as in the Midewiwin, the Shill Society, which is a little further west and north into Canada. Um, but their mark of showing that they're an initiate is they'll put that shell in their palm and show it to the other members, and that act is confirmation for them, even if he's from another tribe or from the same tribe but a different settlement. Yes, he's a member. He's welcome. He can come in and participate in the ceremony. So that's what it's meant to represent. But in the constellation itself, where that's placed in the palm is the exact location of Messier 42, which is the Orion Nebula. And I'm sure Greg is he's the guy who opened me up to this whole thing. So, and I'm sure you've heard
Yeah,
him.
we've done an episode where he kind of goes through all the. Actually, it might even be on our Patreon now that I think about it. But he goes through the metaphysics of the Native Americans, kind of what you're describing right now.
Yeah, he gets it for sure. And so this the Orion Nebula they see as a what's called an ogie. That's not a Native American word. That's a word from uh, you'll primarily see it, if you see it at all, in descriptions of ornaments on houses or on furniture. But it's a shape that has a curve with curves coming up on the side, almost kind of like an F hole in a violin. That, if we took half of that, we could call that an ogie. But the soul, initially, only the soul of the chief, the shaman, the elites, at death would know to travel through this hole. They would launch themselves, their soul, in the form of an arrow through that opening. And that's how they would gain access to the Milky Way. To give you a picture, if we imagine this as the Earth, going this way, we have the ecliptic, which is where the sun rises, the moon, all the planets travel through this path. Now, going this way is the Milky Way wrapping around. So naturally, there are two intersection points where the ecliptic meets the Milky Way. At those 2 points are where there are two portals in the sky. And we see the same exact thing in the theurgic model in late antiquity. Even before that, there are hints of it in Plato and even in Homer. But so the the southern entrance, the point of intersection, is located exactly at that ogie at Messier 42 within the constellation of Orion, or the chief's hand. Um, so that's the goal. That's what they're trying to do. Now, at Cahokia, and this research was done by another absolutely brilliant scholar named William F. Romaine. He's got at least 3 books on the subject where he really dives deep into this. But at the right time of the year, um, there's a main mound, the big mound at the center, but then there's a causeway, like a road that's built that leads to a smaller mound that is in the shape of the Ogie in the Orion constellation. And that causeway represents the path that the soul would travel. And it's done on the night when the Milky Way which, in my model here, just because this is easier to juxtapose with a vertical, it's actually at a tilt. The Milky Way is at a tilt. And on the summer solstice, it aligns with that spot, which becomes a veritable launch pad, like you said, a launch pad for the soul to immediately enter the Milky Way. And I should clarify the southern portal in the Orion thing. That is a portal, and it became the primary portal used, especially with uh, um, later complexes like Moundville, which was a necropolis. But by this point, it wasn't just the elite. They had evolved to where the shamans in these sodalities would offer to take people who hadn't been initiated into this wisdom for a nominal fee. They would take you or a loved one who had passed away along this path, like a psychopomp guide. They would leave their body through ritual psychedelics and guide the soul of the dead safely onto the Milky Way and then come back. Now, at the time of Cahokia, they would actually use the northern portal and at the summer solstice instead of the winter solstice. It's at the winter solstice when Orion is visible. And after winter, Orion's no longer visible in the sky. Well, the reason they're opting for the Orion portal is because they're taking people who weren't initiated. Now, at the opposite portal, the one that they were primarily using at Cahokia, it's within the vicinity of what we recognize as Scorpio. For them, it wasn't Scorpio, it was the Great Serpent constellation. And this serpent is also the below world entity. Um, the Scorpio constellation is only visible in the summer night sky, just like Orion is only in the winter night sky. And what this serpent did mythologically was police the skies for anyone attempting to enter that portal who hadn't been initiated into the secret wisdom, who wasn't a member of a sodality, wasn't an elite, wasn't a chief. And if that happened, he would knock them out of the sky and they would fall to the below world where he eventually goes. So following summer, Scorpio never rises above the horizon. And at this point, this feathered serpent constellation, once he descends, he sheds his feathers and becomes what's known as the underwater panther and hibernates in the underworld like a bear or a panther hibernating down there. But he knocks people down to make sure they can't access this sacred domain where the happy dead go. Um, so, like I said, just to clarify, at that time, Cahokia is an early civilization within the Mississippian timeline. And at that point, just like with Egypt, it's still limited to people who had been initiated. But once we get further towards the end of the timeline, especially at Moundville, they're allowing people who weren't initiated to go with the help of someone who was initiated as a psychopomp. But for that reason, they had to avoid Scorpio, the great serpent. So they did it at a time when it was totally below the horizon in the underworld, and that gave them safe passage to the Ogi located in Orion or the chief's hand.
Interesting. The Spyro shells of Oklahoma, which artifact out of, that realm of research do you think shows most convincingly some sort of metaphysical design? And then to piggyback on that, why do you think so many academics mischaracterize some of these artifacts as toys?
Mm, that's a great question. Um, I think probably the most interesting is the hollow mound that's became like an earth lodge, as they're sometimes called, and it was hollow, so it was effectively a cave. And I think it was either Langford or Riley, but they said, "What is a mound but a man-made cave?" And that I think speaks also to the significance of caves and these practices. But this one was intentionally made hollow, and the cavity was supported by, I believe it was cedar, giant cedar posts, and within it were placed statues and pipes that were created as effigies of the particular supernatural beings that one could expect to encounter in the path of soul's journey. They represented the trials that one had to pass, like metaphysical landmarks, but they were placed in their proper positions within this opening. And um, it's terrible. This mound was first accessed by people who had no business being in it, and they created a fictitious mining company to give the appearance that what they were doing was official. But when the local university, found out about it, they immediately got a statement issued that they had to vacate those premises, because that was not only a sacred area, but needed to be studied by those who were qualified to study it, because these people were looting it and then going and setting up stands on the highway and selling these pieces, for pennies. And there were thousands and thousands, just shell cups alone, thousands of them discovered in this thing, in addition to these pipes and statues. But once they got the order, they decided to fill it up with kegs of dynamite and blew it up, uh, destroyed it, and anything that was left. And if it wasn't for one of the individuals involved, a drawing he made of everything inside it before they raided it, we'd have no idea what it looked like in there. But he did. So as despicable as he is, we should still give him credit for the drawing, because otherwise we wouldn't know anything about it. But that to me is the most fascinating, um, because not only does it give us a picture of a real picture, it's not just, we're not speculating anymore. We're looking at what they imagine the path of souls look like. But because of all the shell cups there, many of which tested positive for substances like datura, it becomes like a North American, almost like Eleusinian mysteries. Like we're looking at the telesterion, where they would drink the kykeon and experience what they interpreted as the afterlife through the psychedelic, training for death. We're seeing something like that with this place set up like the afterlife as they imagined it, and with all of these cups that um, were likely the cups belonging to individuals who went through it. These cups weren't just, oh, let's drink from the shell cup and throw it away. The cups were often inscribed with images, and those images were super supernatural beings that one could expect to encounter on the path of souls, which in effect became the degrees, right? Remember I said it was a degreed structure. So once you get to a certain degree, you receive a new cup that has the image of the supernatural associated with that point in the journey. And this explains why so many people were buried with their cup, because it was quite literally a mark of their identity. It showed other people where they were, not as a nobleman necessarily, but where they were as a member of a sodality, that they were possessed of a certain wisdom that many people didn't have, and it set them apart, it marked them. And we know this from a story that was preserved by Langford, where this chief needs to send a message to a chief at a neighboring tribe, and he sends his son as the emissary, and he gives his son his shell cup, and he says, be sure to show this to the chief so that he knows it came from me, you know very clearly indicating that it was a mark of identity, not something he was going to trade with the chief. but something to say, here's proof that I'm from X, you know. Um, so yeah, it opens up an aspect of Native American ritual culture in the Southeast that provides just one more really striking parallel to what we imagine to be a Greek phenomenon. You know, you encounter so much, especially in 19th century scholarship on ancient Greece. They call it the Greek miracle. Like everybody was stupid in the whole world until these Greeks came along and brought us reason. Um, and it's absurd. It's nonsense. And we're seeing that writing or no writing, the what the Native Americans in the Southeast were doing was just as sophisticated, just as complex, and just as magical as anything that emerged out of Greek culture. They would interpret them as toys. Um, that it's because they've completely lost touch with the magic of nature, of being. In the ancient world, everything reflected nature. It wasn't until the development of things like chariots that we even see something resembling cars and things on wheels. But going all the way back to the Stone Age, there was this amazing piece of amber that was carved into a small bear. Clearly a ritualistic object, maybe indicative of a clan, of a vision, of a power being given to them by receiving it. But some of the first discussions of it were that it was probably a toy, you know, this delicate, perfectly carved object, and that's the best they could come up with, was it's probably a toy. So I think that's just the tendency of academia, particularly at a time when that bias exists that says there is no magic. It must be something practical, therefore it must be a toy, because I can imagine doing anything with this. But it just shows their lack of imagination, lack of innovation, and the bias that exists towards discussing the sacred in any way other than to demarcate it from the mundane within a rite of passage model.
In chapter 7, we're talking about Mississippian shamans and shamanism. Do you think the Mississippian shaman was closer to a pharmacologist, astronomer, psychonaut, or do you think they were all three simultaneously?
Oh yeah, definitely the latter. And before I answer this in more complete terms, uh, it is important to distinguish between what a shaman actually was and what we use the word to describe. Since the time of the late 19th century, when anthropologists were trying to find a term that could be universally used to cover all of these different types of people, because they are vastly different depending on where we're talking about. Um, but the word itself comes from, likely stems from the Tungus people, which were Siberian, are Siberian. They still exist. But that's where we get the word saman from. And the practices they exhibit became the criteria for what modern academics used to describe these people in vastly different settings. But they are very different, and oftentimes, sometimes the word gets used for types of practitioners that it really doesn't fit with. And Sasha Chetow has recently pointed this out in regard to ancient Greece. And while I think what she's saying is relevant, I also see the usefulness in having a universal term, um, because a lot of it is contact with the dead, communication with the dead, contact with and communication with supernatural beings, nature spirits. Um, and Native American tradition, a big part of it consisted of being dead. The shaman able to enter a state that for himself and for the observers very much looked like he was dead, and is being raised from the dead, often by another shaman who's there as kind of to watch him, to help him keep his body safe, things like that. But that being said, I do think it's a useful term, and the principal concern within many of the southeastern traditions were healing, and that's fairly universal. And the healing, we think about medicine largely in terms of physical ailments, fixing something physical, but medicine, uh, for many Native American cultures, can be something like, I'll give you an example. Um, the first time I sat with a group of Lakota doing a pipe ceremony, a butterfly came and landed on my shoulder. And I thought that was neat, interesting, but for them it was something else. They started talking about butterfly medicine, and I thought, what do you mean? Butterfly medicine, and for them, medicine is something that can come along and bless you, give you help, give you assistance, boost you, but it's giving you something that you're missing. So they would have perceived that as, I arrived missing something the butterfly had to offer. And this is a fairly common way of thinking in different shamanic traditions, that let's say that that I want to develop the power of flight, or I want to develop the ability to see farther than I should be able to see as a man. This consists in a number of cases of being able to acquire the power of an eagle, or a hawk, something that has incredible sight, that has the ability to fly seemingly all the way up to the sun. We think about man, especially in post-Christian Judeo-Christian traditions, as being evolved beyond animals, as being something superior to animals. And in many shamanic settings, that's not the case. These beings are more evolved than us, uh, and that's why they have magic we don't have. Um, and even in postmodern and metamodern settings where these traditions are continued, but the cultures have evolved with the times, they'll view it in conjunction with the Judeo-Christian kind of model, that yes, we're evolved beyond them, but that also means we've evolved beyond magic. And to acquire magic powers, we have to recover our eagle. We have to recover our hawk that we have lost touch with, but it's somewhere, um, oftentimes in us, or in the more ancient picture, it's out there, um, and we have to get it from them. So medicine can be something like that. And what I was getting from the butterfly, I didn't press it at the time because the notion was really foreign to me, and I didn't really understand what they were saying, and I didn't feel like I was in a position to quiz them, interrogate them about that particular thing. But over the years, I've gradually come to understand that medicine is acquiring something missing. So healing can mean a number of different things, but healing is a major factor. Recovery of the soul or souls is a major factor. We, again, in post-Christian, Judeo-Christian setting, we think of we have a soul. But for many indigenous traditions, we have many souls. You can have, in Africa, there's a bush soul that's separate from the dreaming soul, and there's evidence that in certain times in ancient Egypt, there were as many as seven souls. Um, but the Native Americans in the Southeast most commonly believed in two souls. And these two souls were there's a free soul that is the soul that is able to leave the body in dreams and vision quests. And then there's a second soul that's bound to the earth that stays after death. So after the physical body dies, the free soul is able to ascend and follow the path of souls, while the other soul is bound here. And we see an analog to that in ancient Egypt, where there's a Ba and a Ka soul. And the Ba soul is often depicted as a bird with the face of the deceased. And that's the one that is able to uh, go on the journey into the Duat, like we see in the pyramid coffin and Book of the Dead texts. Whereas the Ka remains behind in the form of a statue that is sometimes in the burial. Sometimes there are a number of Kas put in one spot. But I like to think about it, um, because we are so meta-modern and post-Judeo-Christian in our thinking. I like to think about the free soul or the Ba as being akin to our suke or psyche, the part of it's clearly us, it's our emotional mental disposition, it's the locus of ourselves, that many believe continue after death. Whereas the Ka remains behind, um, number one, because it comes from the earth. It doesn't originate somewhere else like the free soul is thought to do. Um, and number two, in the Egyptian tradition, the Ka is the source of luck. It's the source of beneficial things bestowed on you from your ancestors. So it's easy, might not be correct, but it's easy to think of the Ka as genetics. You can see how genetics are just as much you as your psyche is you. But one remains behind for the sake of your descendants. They carry your genes, whereas the other one is envisaged as going off somewhere else. That being said, these souls, one or more of them, can get lost. This can happen through trauma, through illness, depression, and these states were seen as requiring someone, the shaman, to go and retrieve them. And so they oftentimes they would have to go to the land of the dead, find the soul, and bring it back to them. Um, so soul retrieval is a big part of that, and that qualifies them as a psychopomp, which is this. It's similar to what we're seeing in Moundville with the shamans guiding the dead. Instead of guiding them to the realm of the dead, they're guiding them back because the body isn't ready to die, um, and it needs its soul to remain active participant in the tribe, to contribute what they contribute, which might be hunting, it might be sewing, it could be anything, but they need them for the tribe to persist. There's not just an infinite number um, of people who can say make bread, or knows how to go out and gather all these herbs. So it's incumbent upon them, for the sake of the whole tribe, to go and retrieve this soul, bring it back to them. Um, but they do these things often in conjunction with certain astrological timings. So, yes, they're also astrologers in a way. Now, they didn't divide the year in the same way we do. We're a solar people. We divide our calendar into the 360 plus degrees of the solar circuit, the annual circuit. We divide that into an equal segment of 12 sections, each of which has 30 degrees in them. You know, so everything we do and did, from planting to harvesting, everything was based on that solar circuit. They were a lunar people, and many still are, but they used a lunar calendar. And we usually think of a lunar calendar as being 13 months of 28 days each, which gives us the same end result of a year. And but it doesn't line up with the sun. It takes 19 years for the two to align. That's called metonic time. Well, for them, they didn't look at the lunar year. They were observing, and this probably took centuries of one person observing, passing that information on, him observing. But they're not just looking at the moon phases, because the moon changes. You think, if you had no idea about how long a year was and you were watching the sun doesn't change physically. It stays circular, but the moon changes, goes through phases and changes. So naturally that would lend itself to keeping time more easily and quickly than would the sun. But in addition to the cyclical changes, they noticed that, just like with the sun through the seasons, it would rise on a different place on the horizon, and it would rise to a different height in the sky. And that's what we're dealing with when you look at the poverty point cultures down in Louisiana, where they have the wood hinges, these hinges. And the mound complexes function they function the same way, where you can stand in one spot, and at the moment of moonrise or sunrise, you determine which of these poles or which of these mounds aligns with the moonrise at a given time. And that's how they discovered, um, well, I shouldn't say that's how they discovered, that's why they built them, but they discovered that the moon had a broader cycle of 18.6 years, and they call that the minor and major lunestices, or lunar standstills. It's the lunar equivalent of a solstice. It's called a lunistis. And when we got to the major and the minor, those for them were literally understood as the world being recreated. At that moment, all of creation was renewed. Naturally, they didn't feel a pause. There's a, just like we have continuity of consciousness through the seasons, but they understood that at that point everything was renewed. And they started using it in a magical context eventually, because a drought crept in. Now, Cahokia was the first big major complex site with hundreds of thousands of people potentially living there. You can imagine how much corn would be required to sustain them. We're talking about millions of corn plants just to sustain them for a year. So when drought came, um, they don't know what to do. They're dying off in huge numbers. Some are migrating, trying to go somewhere where it's better. So how do they sustain this population? Well, they started timing rituals with these major and minor lunar standstills to try to affect time being restarted. That they could, if they did the ritual just right, acted out the things that happened at the beginning of time in just the right way, they could restart creation themselves. So yes, there was a heavy astrological component to what the shamans were doing, especially by that time. Now, prior to that, most evidence, it looks like they're aware of this lunar timing, but instead of trying to use it to restart time, they're trying to use it to increase or embrace meteorological activity, to make it rain. Um, and that's what early sweat lodges, the earliest sweat lodges, looks like they were doing. It wasn't just a way to relax in a hot tub, it was a ritual. The filling up with all that steam was a way to affect rainfall on a miniature, on a microcosmic scale, to affect broader rainfall, in the world around them. So very, very astrological. And what was the third qualifier you mentioned? You said astrological.
Psychonaut. I mean, it kind of touches on a little bit of
Yeah,
all,
yeah, yeah,
but yeah,
yeah.
no, it's a good breakdown. And yeah, I think that, as you mentioned, when we think about these, somebody pictures somebody, with a group and leading them in some sort of like psychedelic circle or trance circle or something like that. But obviously, there's a lot more involved with that. And as academia dives even deeper into these topics, I think that we'll probably see more and more of kind of what you're talking about. Which brings me to my next question. If the Missihuasca hypothesis is correct, it's obviously enormous, but why do you think academia hasn't wrestled with the possibility of this even harder?
I think it's a simple reason. the like I said earlier, none of the academic sources in any of the different disciplines that I've encountered are aware that NN-DMT is in the honey locust. It's not mentioned anywhere. And the only source that I did find it in is something that no self-respecting academic would open. Some simple tryptamines, a book written by a guy who's trying to figure out, what can I trip on outside? Like, what in nature can I use to have a psychedelic experience? And I think that's the main reason. It has to do with their readiness to dismiss a source if it doesn't meet their criteria, which for them means peer review, and there's a lot to be said for peer review. But to pretend that the author of Keeper of the Trout book, Some Simple Tryptamines, the notion that that wasn't peer review is ridiculous. It wasn't reviewed by peers in a university, but he had a team of people helping him with this mass spectrometry. How do you pronounce it? Mass scope.
Spectrometer? No.
That's how he tested it and found
Yeah.
the DMT present. But the idea that laymen that are sophisticated enough to do that aren't worthy of consideration, um, because they didn't graduate from a university, is absurd, um, and will only hurt them in the long run. Uh,
You could
because
say the opposite though too, right? Like you could say, while obviously this is how you do science using the scientific method and all these techniques, there's something to be said about mind, which we don't fully understand yet. And then these compounds that interact with that mind, that maybe even a lot of these, maybe some of these people have used cannabis in college or something like that. But I've only found really a few academics that are outwardly spoken about their use, other than the people that write about or work within psychedelic science, if you know what I'm saying. So it's like,
Mhm.
I think it's they're missing this component which you're willing to do, which is like put yourself in these mindsets or actually test these things out personally. I don't see much of that within academia, and if you did, you probably see more ethnobotany, more a lot of chemical samples being studied looking for psychoactive compounds and things like that. So that's why I think what you're doing is important, because it's bringing more attention to something not only just within a field, but also this specific topic, which is Native American psychoactive compounds and rituals.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I agree. And the problem is that unless what you're researching, if you happen to be an academic researching psychoactive, narcotic, hallucinogenic plants, no one wants to fund that. You know, the only ones that want to fund that are the pharmaceutical companies that think they'll get the benefit of being able to market whatever is found. So you get people like, Wade Davis, a brilliant researcher and writer. Um, but he's sent to the Amazon by pharmaceutical companies looking for drugs. He's sent to Haiti looking for the zombie drug so that they can get a new anesthetic. If it's not something like that, universities just, I mean, and I see a change happening, and hopefully it'll happen more. But prior to literally the last 15 years, you wouldn't just not get funded, you would be dismissed from your station. you know that's just not something that they wanted to be associated with. um but more for people like me.
Yeah, totally. And like I said, I appreciate that's why I appreciate your work is because you are willing to put yourself out there like that. Um, what evidence would you like to see discovered next while we're on this topic? Like chemical residues, botanical finds, more cave iconography? Like, what are you hopeful for or looking forward to?
I would love to see um some research done in an attempt to discover any evidence of tryptamines in pots, shells. Um, I said earlier that it's doubtful that it would be there, but at the same time, the team that was researching the shell cups at Spyro, um, that's not something they were looking for. They were looking for things like datura and tobacco. So it's doubtful that they would have known even if they did find it, because it wasn't something they were actively searching for. But that's what I would love to see some effort, some time, some resources put into. Um, and I think the best chances would be within Cherokee uh, artifacts, because we know that they were planting these things. We know that they were it was wrapped up with their ball game. And just as an example of again how we're so divorced from the idea that everything is sacred. For us, a ball game is recreation. We go to have a good time, watch two teams play. Um, but it wasn't like that for them. What they're acting out on the field where they play these games was cosmological. They're participating in cosmological powers, and there's even evidence that the winners or losers of these games also served a divinatory function that could tell them how well crops might do, or how bad they might do, which, knowing something like that, gives them time to prepare for the worst. No matter how you feel about divination, um, and how legitimate the information gleaned from it is, for them it's real, and it changes the entire way they prepare for what's coming. And in that preparing, chances are you're going to discover new ways to prepare. And if it works, will likely become the norm for the next years, for the following decades. It's through that reaching into the unknown and trying to find a solution that new life ways emerge, and those kinds of settings. So, so yeah, I would love to see some resources poured just into the Missihuasca hypothesis as a whole, um, because I really do. Um, I don't want to say I believe that's what was going on, but I do think there's ample evidence uh, to support the hypothesis. And if more people within that domain of study, like, you know, did like Christine Van Poel has done, and take that seriously, regardless of the fact that it wasn't found by someone in their department. That's the problem you run into is I don't have credentials to be studying this stuff, but I also don't think they're needed. The literature's published. You don't have to take a class and get a diploma to read the same text that the professor is teaching from. Those texts are available. Um, so that's what I would like to see. More research poured into that, and more scholars, not necessarily academic scholars, preferably from both fields, stepping in to look at these problems. Because, like you said, most academics aren't doing psychedelics. So when they see psychedelics or evidence of their use, they're not always going to see it. They're not looking at it with the eyes of someone that's been out stripping root bark and boiling it with other plants, to consume it. So it just goes right past them. So yeah, I think we could all benefit from people from all walks of life who have an interest in this stuff, looking at it and telling the rest of us what they see.
Absolutely. And why not go to the source too, and use that lens of gnosis or knowledge and kind of apply it to that, kind of like what you're doing. So, yeah, totally. Um, One more question before we get to Mike's mind melters. Do you think the ghosts, or, what we're calling ghosts, are the dead? Or do you think they're like some sort, like information imprints that, gets amplified through ritual, or do you think there's some sort of like interdimensional beings, or something along those lines?
That's a good question. And I think by the second, you mean like the kind of like the stone tape theory, like it's recorded in the environment. And
Yeah, or even like a Rupert Sheldrake morphic resonance, like something. Yeah, is like, I don't know if you've ever seen that documentary, Muscle Shoals, about the famous recording studio, but they say like anybody that records in the studio says that there's like something like there's like a living presence in the room, and that's why all these great albums came out of there. So something along those lines.
I certainly believe in that. The Greeks called it a spiritus loci, a genius of a location. And we think about a genius as being someone radically intelligent of their own constitution. But this wasn't the case for the Greeks and people in the Middle East. Genius is something you acquire. It's like a daemon that comes. Like Socrates said, he has a daemonion that informs him of things before they happen and tells him how to act or respond in certain ways. um, and I absolutely believe that certain locations harbor these types of spirits, entities. I don't think it matters what we call them, uh, to acknowledge that there is an effect. When you look at something like Stax Records in Memphis, or Muscle Shoals, or Motown in Detroit, I mean, there's something going on in that spot, regardless of who is there playing the instrument, who is singing the song, who wrote the song. But the moment it is brought to that location and laid down on tape, something magical happens. And the same is true at certain locations. I know we've talked a little bit in the past about, outdoors kinds of stuff. And even festivals, when they have them at the same place year after year, every other year, something happens there. Now, whether it's brought with the activities of the people who are there doing whatever they're doing, or whether those people chose that place to do it because it's conducive to or is in alignment with what they plan to do. Um, I don't think we can necessarily know, and I also don't think it matters. But I do believe that there s- we could say electromagnetic, but if it's something we can observe scientifically, um, and put our finger on, it doesn't matter what we call it, because anything we call it, we're explaining it away. We're not explaining it. We're just kind of putting it in a neat box. But being open to the mystery of why this place, why these people, yeah, I think there's something spooky going on. Do I think there are ghosts? I mean, yes, I think in a way we're ghosts. And Palo, this Bantu African tradition that was preserved by slaves that were exported into Cuba. They preserved their religion in the New World, and it, of course, naturally changed to reflect the area they're performing it. Took on some of the characteristics of the Protestants they were enslaved by, the Nigerian Lukumi practitioners that they were enslaved next to. Um, but one of the things that I was told when I was first initiated into Palo was that we're only alive to the degree that the dead can pass through us. That the moment the dead stop passing through us is the moment we're also dead. And, if you look at the world as we've got the material realm and then something else. In the domain of psychology, they're going to call that mental or psychological, where we project things. If you go to a more traditional society, they'll say that's the land of the dead and the ancestors. You go to a theistic society, they're going to say that's the realm of the gods, spirits, angels, demons, things like that. But it doesn't matter what we call it. We're basically dividing the world into two. And if the dead are spirits, and if the other world is the spiritual domain juxtaposed with our material domain, does it matter what we call it? We're really just saying there's something else that interpenetrates and affects us. Um, your cultural conditioning is what's going to determine how you identify that thing. But I think there's a certain magic in allowing yourself to be vulnerable to not knowing, and still participating in it, living in the mystery. For me, that's far more honest with myself. If I try and say that's a ghost, uh, that's an alien, that's a fairy, I think what we're doing is reducing our ability to perceive its action. The minute we say that's a car is the same minute it's not going to fly. And if it does, we probably won't see it as a car anymore. So being in that state of vulnerability of not knowing, I think gives us more opportunity to observe the phenomena of the other, rather than trying to say it's this thing and this thing does this. It's characterized by these behaviors, um, which is naturally going to make us dismissive of or completely blind to anything else it might do.
Interesting. Well, thank you for answering that. Are you ready for Mike's mind melters?
I don't know, man. It sounds intimidating.
I think it'll be good for you. But here we go. right, Danny, are you ready? I'm going to ask you 5 philosophical questions. Just answer them the best and as concisely as you can. And here we go.
Hit me.
Number 1. What is something that you believe in that you know is probably wrong or illogical, but you are just not being honest with yourself?
Probably that I exist, and I specifically mean existing as an individual something. Um, I think that's probably fallacious. Uh, we have this first party perspective of the world. We have an internal life, internal dialogue, but we buy into this notion that we're abstracted from the world, we're abstracted from nature. Um, and I think it's useful, uh, particularly for the discovery of technology, creation of art, and things like that. But I think it's probably fallacious, and that ties in with free will. We all like to believe we have free will, and I'm not necessarily sure that's the case. We are subject to so many external factors. We're subject to so many genetic tendencies. We're subject to traumatic responses that we don't know we have. Um, that it begins to look like we don't so much have free will as we have freedom of surrendering or struggling, if that makes sense. Surrendering to, I hate to use the word fate, but surrendering to the world as it is, or struggling against seeing as it is, which would also say struggling to see the world as you wish it were. Um, but I think either way we say it, it really puts a lot of suspicion on the reality of free will and on the question of whether or not we exist at all as beings that are somehow separate from everything else here. That's probably
I like it.
my belief,
Yeah,
fallacious belief.
I always think about it like Simone Laplace's billiards break, in terms of like if or God's billiards break, I should say, where if you had all the physics and you had the knowledge of the universe and we're able to, like, obviously we quantify things, right? We can observe, we can measure. If you did that on a macro scale, you could probably figure out about us in that way. So like internally we have free will, externally we have no free will. If that makes sense, like the universe, if there is a creator or somebody controlling it, probably would have the knowledge of what's going to happen next, and internally we don't have that ability, so it's free will.
Hmm. Yeah, I envision a car on a highway with guardrails on each side, and free will really amounts to I can hit the rail on the left or the rail on the right, but I'm likely never going to get off this highway.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. um Number 2, do you think there is an objective purpose for humanity? And if so, what do you think it is?
I do think that we do have an objective purpose. I don't think we can know what it is. Um, and this is not anything logical, reasonable. It's strictly faith that there is some purpose to this. Now, that being said, I also ascribe to the deconstructionist idea that we make meaning as we go. Now, that's not to say that meaning does not exist until we make it. It's the part of me that has faith, the part of me that has seen it on, you know, 10, 15 grams of mushrooms or a 10 strip of acid. Uh, Meaning exists in the world in those states. Whether or not that my awareness of that meaning fades afterwards, the memory of it remains. And it's in that memory that I have faith that there was a time when I saw meaning in the world, you know. But I also think that part of what we do, and it's which probably has something to do with not being able to know what that meaning is, the big meaning that we previously just discussed, is making meaning as we go. And I hate to use a phrase, cliche new age kind of like co-creators with God. I hate that kind of thinking, you know, but it does seem to have some kind of grasp of the idea that we do have the power to make meaning. And I think that's part of what art is. I think that's part of what discovery, technology, um, all of that has to do with making meaning. Uh, but it's probably very different from objective meaning in the world.
Yeah, like God's or a God's art.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I like it. Number 3. Do you think humans are special or separate from nature? If your answer is yes, please give me your best example of why.
No, no, and that goes back to the first question. I don't think we're separate. I think we buy into the illusion that we're separate, which is probably a major source for a lot of the shit that we're putting the planet through. You know, just the pollution that affects innumerable ecosystems, and litter and plastics in the ocean. The earth is resilient. It's not that I'm saying that we're killing the earth, but we're killing ourselves by, I'm sure there's what is it, Sherwin-Williams, that has the picture. Their slogan is "Paint the Earth," and it's a picture of the Earth being covered in paint. I've always thought that was the most disgusting icon. Who would say that to represent their product and what they have to offer? But that's what we're doing. We're covering the planet, and in doing so, painting a wall between ourselves and the planet to further abstract us, to say we're separate, we're above nature. But anybody who's taken ayahuasca or good dose mushrooms knows that nature is far smarter than we are. I look at things like there's a moth that looks like an owl. It's got owl eyes. It looks like it's got owl feathers. But that species didn't have a meeting and say, it would be cool if we had moth eyes on us, so that then the things we eat, it won't affect them, but the things that eat us, it's their predator. So if we could look like the predator of our predators, that would be fucking sweet if we could do that. They didn't do that. The intelligence of nature itself, think about it's once removed. It's not that they look like their predators, they look like the predator of their predators. That's smart. Super smart. There's other moths that look like snakes for the same reason. The tips of their wings are perfect snake heads with eyes and mouths, and um, it just shows that there is an intelligence, a logos present in nature that is far smarter than the most intelligent human on the planet, and automatic. It doesn't take reasoning or an equation to come to the conclusion. It just is, it just does. So, no, I don't think humans are above or separate from nature. It's just the lie we tell ourselves so that we don't feel as bad as we should about a lot of the shit we're doing.
Totally. Totally. I identify with a lot of that. And, you know, there's very few arguments, if any, that you could make that there's not already a proto version of something else that's capable of what we're doing in nature, just not on the level that we're doing it at.
Yeah.
So to
Yeah.
say that we're a one off, well, you'd be very hard pressed to find, you know, like I said, some non proto version of that. I like it. Number 4. What do you think happens when we die?
I don't know. To be completely honest, I think anything we could say about it would be speculation. If we want to give credence to the people who have had near-death experiences and come back and tell us what happened. I've had a near-death experience. I'm sure you remember in 2015, I was struck by lightning and had a full-on near-death experience. But whether or not that's what really is going to happen when we die, what happened to me was so different than any other near-death experience I've ever read. So I don't think we can necessarily glean any universal information about what might happen to a specific individual when they die. Um, so reincarnation, total oblivion, uh, the life of the soul in another place. My own near-death experience, my own psychedelic experiences, my own experiences in the domains of magic and mysticism and inducing out-of-body experiences. I tend to suspect that there is continuity of consciousness beyond death, that in some ways it resembles a physical world, albeit with laws that are very different than what we're used to here. But to say that I believe that, no, I have no idea. And it would just be, again, a question of faith. And I do have faith that there's continuity of consciousness. I don't like to support that with the positivist materialist kind of logic that material energy is never destroyed, it's only converted. um, I don't think that proves anything because we're not talking about energy in a material sense. We're talking about what seems to be something else. So no, I don't have any proof for it. It's simply a faith thing. But ultimately, I don't think any of us can know that. And I think that's part of the real beauty of it. Just participating in the mystery, surrendering to that mystery. Um, there is a sacred vulnerability to that can either be the most terrifying thing that you've ever considered or the most liberating thing. It just depends on how you let it hit you. Yeah.
Interesting. Number 5. 2 possibilities exist. Either we are alone in the universe or we are not. Both are equally terrifying. Arthur C. Clarke. Do you think there's life elsewhere in the universe, or do you think we are alone?
That's a good question. And do you mean, do I think there's life elsewhere
Okay,
or
so
do I
yeah,
think
let me
there's
rephrase that because
mind?
I know, yeah. So do you think that there is material or physical life elsewhere, Not necessarily like, we've talked about like interdimensional beings and possibilities of that, but do you think that there is physical life as we know it somewhere else in the universe?
I suspect that there would be. The universe is just too vast, um, for conditions similar to our Goldilocks zone conditions to have not emerged somewhere. Now, are they carbon based? Do they breathe oxygen? Are they bipedal? Um, all of those things, probably not. Vastly different conditions would produce vastly different beings. I don't think we're alone. But I also don't think we're alone here. Um, like we're surrounded by life. We're surrounded by more to the point. We're surrounded by mind. I'm of the opinion that everything that exists participates in mind to the degree that it's capable. There is a certain kind of knowing to a mineral. There's a knowing to uh, uh, a, a piece of mica that knows how to cube. There's a knowing to a crystal lattice that does what it does. And I don't think it's an automatic, mindless process. I think mind drives it to the degree that it can participate in mind. So, life, probably, mind, absolutely.
I like it. Thank you for answering Mike's Mind Melters. We've had you on a million times, and obviously, since I came back after a little bit of a hiatus, we've added this new segment. So I appreciate you answering those. And yeah, I really enjoyed the this last book, Tripping the Trail of Ghosts. Obviously, it's kind of would you call it your magnum opus of Missihuasca, or do you think you're going to expound on it at any point?
Um, that's probably the extent of what I'm going to do in the domain of Native American research. Not because I think I've exhausted the field. I've just, my interests are all over the place. And if I spend too much time on that, then I'm going to do it at the expense of something else that I would really like to, give my perspective on. So that's probably it. And also, realizing that a number of really important thinkers have read that book, and are carrying that research further in ways that I couldn't. Particularly, there's some indigenous authors, some academic authors. Chris Van Poel is a good example, um, that have really picked that up and are taking it in places that I'm just not qualified to do. And I'm content that they'll get it where it needs to go. And in the meantime, I've got a handful of other projects I'm working on right now. By the time those are done, there'll be another handful. I just bounce around. I follow my nose.
No, I like it. I mean, that's kind of how I run this podcast for that matter. I just, whatever I'm interested in, or books that I've been reading, or something's really been hitting me hard, or I do a lot of reflecting and something comes to me, I have the same approach. I think that's a good approach to have, because whatever you're passionate about at that time or at that moment, it's going to come out in whatever creative endeavor it is, whether it's a book,
Right.
a documentary, a podcast, whatever it is. So I like that approach. And yeah, I think you have a great take on that. Like you said, you realize the limits of what you're capable of, so you're going to let other people carry that torch. And I think that that's a perfect way to approach that. And I think more people should take that approach based on some of the stuff I see people putting on or putting out there. But yeah, man, as usual, it's always fun having you on. If anybody has not checked out Alchemically Stone, you can start there, work your way to Angels and Vermilion. And then we did a cool episode when you came out with Theurgy. Theory and Practice, and I really enjoyed that one as well. And yeah, this new one, Tripping the Trail of Ghosts. If you like history, psychedelics, ritual, esoteric stuff, I think it's the perfect combination of all of that. So, and you're not in academia, so you're able to kind of theorize, hypothesize, speculate a little bit more, which is always fun as well. And yeah, man, like I said, I really appreciate you sharing all your knowledge and research. And obviously, we'll have you back on in the future, and you and I text regularly and talk and about crazy weird stuff we're into and experiencing and stuff like that. And yeah, why don't you, if you want to just drop real quick a little bit of a nugget on your next two projects here that we were talking about off air.
Yeah. Well, we're kind of stepping out of the domain of literature and working on a couple of documentaries. We're nearing the completion of the first documentary, which is following the timeline in my second book, Angels in Vermilion. And for those who aren't familiar with that book, it looks at the tradition of alchemy that fed into Freemasonry and fundamentally altered the ritual by introducing acacia into that ritual. And the question that drove me, that kind of blew the doors off of all of this research in that book and my previous book, was why is the acacia put there? Because when I went through the Master Mason degree and first encountered that acacia, I had just finished extracting my first batch of NNDMT from acacia, and so I thought, wow, that's either a really interesting synchronicity or there's something more at work with this sprig of acacia. So I really dove in, read every version of the ritual I could find, and then finally found the evidence that proved that they were consuming the acacia specifically for its visionary qualities. Um, and the documentary follows that tradition from Egypt on into Prague with John Dee and Edward Kelly, into London with the Royal Society, which is the first group that was looking at this problem after Elias Ashmole had inherited these papers and was trying to make his Enochian magic system work, but couldn't, and decided that it was because he didn't have this red powder Edward Kelly had. So they go on this wild goose chase looking for a drug that would fit that bill. What they decide on is acacia, and that is what leads the research assistant to Sir Isaac Newton, a man named John Theophilus de Segulier, after he was installed as the third Grand Master of the Premier Grand Lodge in London, to put the acacia in Masonic ritual. So yeah, we in that documentary we've gone to all the places where this happened, taken experts in those particular areas of research with us, conducted interviews with them, telling the story where it happened. And the director of the film is my dear friend Alec Hawkins, who is an award-winning filmmaker from Columbus, Mississippi. But he doesn't just make films. It's not just your typical documentary. He is a cinematographer. It's an art film that documents. So we're excited about that. It should be done by the end of this year, end of December, and then we'll be figuring out who's going to carry it for us.
Yeah, we've
And
had
the
Alec on the show too before.
That's right, you have. Yeah, I forgot
We were
about that.
talking about like Charles Manson, MK Ultra, all that kind of jazz when he was on.
Yeah, he knows his Manson lore for sure. Um, and he's also working with me on the next documentary that right now we're in um, the writing phases, not writing a script, but writing kind of an outline, getting all the information in one place, and Oddly enough, it sounds like it's completely out of left field, I admit, given my previous research. But we're looking at the various examples of alien UFO sightings, abductions, contact incidents that happen in Mississippi. Um, and most people don't think about, unless you're thinking about the Pascagoula incident, most people don't think about this stuff in Mississippi. But it is very prevalent. And, there's a lot of consensus today about how whatever these things are like to hover about nuclear facilities and places where nuclear bombs have been detonated. And a little known fact is that in Mississippi in 1964, two nuclear bombs were detonated in Lamar County. And it's after that that these sightings really amped up. But even prior to that, we see them. And the most significant and really what made us say we need to document this somehow, um, was an event known as the Kilgore Hills Moon Man. And this was in a newspaper in 1893. This man, Kilgore Hills is now, there's nothing there. It used to be a little town with a saloon. But this man, Gus Goody, I think was his name, he owned the saloon, and he sees down in a ravine a light coming out of this ravine. And he goes down to investigate it and sees a cylindrical ship down there. And surrounding it are a number of beings that are like 3 feet tall, 3 to 5 feet tall, have large heads, gray skin, and enormous cat like eyes. And as the story goes, and this is treated as folklore in Mississippi, but I'll tell you why I don't think that's the case, um, is that somebody behind Goody also saw them and had his shotgun and shot one of them. The rest of them scramble into this cylinder ship, take off, and the other one lays there dead. And if you're familiar at all with the UFO flaps from the late 19th century, most of them were these cylinder ships, not UFOs, not
Yeah,
discs, the
the
way we.
airship phenomenon. Is that where? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So it fits with that, even though it's never, like, even in Jacques Vallée's Passport to Magonia, where he gives the chronology of all of the known abductions or sightings, he skips right over 1893, never mentions this incident in Mississippi, which I find strange, and I'll tell you why. And it's also the reason why I have my doubts about this just being folklore. But the being they took and placed it on a cot on the porch of Goody's saloon, and people would come by and look at it. Now, this photographer, I think he worked for a newspaper in Houston, Mississippi, gets wind of this, travels down with his camera, and takes pictures and sells the pictures for $1, or he'll take your picture standing next to it for $5. But this only went on for a day because by day two, the smell was so overwhelming that Goody's wife was throwing a fit. She said, "You got to get this thing out of here. This is embarrassing. Nobody's coming in the saloon." So he and the guy who pulled the trigger on the thing, they decide they're going to go bury it in the Kilgore Hills Cemetery. But once they get in there, they realize, well, this isn't a white man. We're in a white man's cemetery. This clearly isn't a man, nor is he white. And so they agree, okay, we'll carry it over to the African American cemetery and we'll bury it there. And the African American folks say, "You're not burying that here. He's not white. He's not a man. Well, he's not African American either. You can't put him in our cemetery." So they carry him back to the white cemetery and decide to build it outside the fence line on a hill. Like, there's a trench on each side, and they put him on this crest of this hill and covered it with sandstone and put an oak marker there that said, "Here lies the Moon Man," because they believed they had come from the moon. Um, and so we drove out there to check this place out, when we got the first footage of it, to see if there even was a crest, a ridge outside the fence. And I walked the entire perimeter, and there was one crest directly behind it. Now, what's interesting is it's got this barbed wire fence. The whole barbed wire fence is intact until you get to where that crest is, and it's permanently pulled back and folded up so people can go through there. And in some of the accounts, people talk about how they still visit the gravesite of this moon man and take their grandkids to see it. And that may be why it's pulled apart there, that people are still going to this place, which is fascinating to me. But the reason I have my suspicions about it not being folklore is because the common consensus among ufologists is that the the picture of the traditional gray alien that we know today came about with the success of Whitley Strieber's Communion, the painting he had put on the cover. Um, but that's not really true, because even if we go back to the Barney and Betty Hill incident, they drew some pictures and made sculptures of what they saw, and it was these 3 to 5 feet tall beings with gray skin that had large cat-like eyes. Um, and when you look at the description in the newspaper from what happened in 1893 in Mississippi, they're described as skinny, 3 to 5 feet tall, large heads with big cat-like eyes. So if it is folklore, that means that Mississippi folklore is the ultimate source for the image of the gray alien as we know it. But the problem is, Betty and Barney Hill, they're in New Hampshire. It's highly doubtful that they would have seen a newspaper clipping from a town in Mississippi that basically consisted of a saloon, you know. Um, and I also find it doubtful that Whitley Strieber would have encountered it. So it either means that a piece of unknown folklore dictated the way we perceived aliens uh, for the next 100 years, you know, or there's something to it worth discussing. And that was really what made us say, you know what, we should just really look at the trajectory of these accounts in Mississippi that start with this in 1893 and persist all the way up to this year, where an event happened in Columbus, where Alec lives. So that's what's next on the docket once we get the DMT Acacia documentary finally out of our hands.
Nice. Yeah, no, I'm excited to see what comes of it. And I know you've been working on this first documentary for a while, so I'm looking forward to that one as well.
Mhm.
And yeah, you were in our documentary too, As Within, So Without, From UFOs to DMT. You describe your own personal encounter that you had with your wife in Mississippi, and I appreciate you sharing your story on that as well. And yeah, man, I mean, I think my ass is asleep right now. So we're gonna have to probably do like a part two, but we should definitely do one on like the UFO stuff. And I think you've got a lot of interesting stuff you've uncovered. And obviously, I had ingrained myself into that world for a bit. And I think you can only keep 1 foot in that world for a bit, before it gets a little chaotic, and you gotta take
If
a
you're
step
if
out.
you're interacting with the people that occupy that domain, uh, y- it gets a little nauseating real quick. I find it best to just keep to myself with this research. Y'all do what you're going to do, but I think 90% of them are completely nuts, egomaniacal, and are just ruining the entire area of research, to be
Well, I think
100% honest.
with social media and clicks and saying salacious shit to get more attention, I think has definitely brought a lot of um, kind of what you're talking about. I have obviously I think when I started doing Mind Escape is really when I started ingraining myself into all these fringe communities and the UFO thing, I've met a lot of cool people, but there is also kind of what you mentioned too. So, you just kind of have to take it for what it is and just remind yourself too, like when you're online, like the same thing applies to everything. So if somebody's trying to get clicks on a political topic, of course they're going to say crazy shit. If they're trying to get clicks on metaphysical fringe topics, of course they're going to say crazy shit. So you just kind of have to keep that in mind when engaging with these communities, because there is a lot of that. And usually, there are your cool people, like I met you through doing this. I met, some of the people that were in our documentary through doing that, so it's just like, there is that, but there's also good, cool, knowledgeable people too. I guess you just kind of have to use your judgment on what's going on there. But,
I agree. They're few and far between. You're right. I have met some really valuable people, um, since I started really looking into this territory. But even so, I'm careful to let them do their research and I do mine, you know.
well, of course, yeah. I mean, I think everybody should always do their own research and just not take word of mouth from somebody. That's how.
Especially with this topic.
Yeah, and look, if you watch our documentary As Within, So Without, I had a couple hypotheses going in. One, that it takes a human mind to interact with this phenomenon, whatever it is. At very least, a mind virus. At most, something otherworldly that we're connected to that we don't know about. And then the other hypothesis is it could just be genetics or part of our evolutionary or evolving our consciousness, in the sense that maybe if you look at like the pantheon of gods from ancient times, or now this might, is a young modern myth style thing, like maybe this is what pushes humanity forward in terms of like achieving the next goal or technology or whatever, in the sense that like we're subconsciously dangling this carrot in front of ourselves, but there's nothing really there, and we're truly these aliens, if you will, by we're creating this myth that we're chasing, that and then we'll invent a new myth when that kind of unfolds or whatever. Now we can kind of see, there's nobody that, I mean, I'm sure there are, but nobody's practicing in a large scale ancient Greek religion based on the pantheon of gods. Nobody's, you could call it paganism or whatever, but in terms of like actually as like a movement, those things kind of go wayside when Thales comes along. Oh no, there's a natural explanation for this phenomenon, and I'm going to buy up all these olive presses and I'm going to make a ton of money because everybody thinks the gods are what's making it rain and there's going to be more olives, but I know that it's just a rainy season, like that kind of a thing. So
They naturalize the gods.
Those were my two hypotheses going into making our documentary, but there is something weird there, and I've never gotten to what that actually is, and I kind of go back and forth a lot about it, but I'm interested to see your take, because I think you have a great perspective on these things, and as you mentioned, you're actually interested in it. You're not just doing it to do it, which some people do. So yeah, man, super looking forward to that. Let's do a full workup and episode on it. We'll try and schedule that. Like I said, if I got to get in butt shape again after my hiatus. I've come back. I realized like 2.5 hours is like the most I can sit without my ass falling asleep. But
I get it.
Yeah, man, I really appreciate it. Click the link down below. I'll have the link for all of PD's books next to the mushroom icon at the bottom. Check out Alchemically Stoned, check out Angels in Vermilion, check out Theurgy. and check out his newest one, Tripping the Trail of Ghosts. And of course, look out for these 2 new documentaries that are going to come out sometime in the next couple years. The first one's probably going to be out sooner than later. But yeah, man, I really appreciate you coming on, and I love our interactions, and even sometimes just texting each other randomly, interesting stuff. I love that. So, yeah, man, I appreciate it, and thank you for sharing all of your knowledge and your efforts.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's good to see you. Good to see you back on.
Good to see you too, man, and you're welcome back on anytime. But we are going to end this the same way we end all of our episodes, which is we love everybody, stay safe out there, and we'll catch you next time. Peace.
If you would like to support Mind Escape, there's many ways you can do it, but the best way to do it is to click the LinkTree link down below. I have everything from merch to our Patreon page. Our Patreon, by the way, I archived a lot of the Mind Escape 1.0 episodes on there. There is still some available on our YouTube channel and our Spotify and Apple Podcast. However, like I said, if you're looking for a specific older episode, it might be on our Patreon, which has been archived, and it's $2 a month. And there's also exclusive content on there as well that was never released to any other platform. So please go check that out. You can also check out our documentary that Maurice and I made a few years ago called As Within, So Without, From UFOs to DMT. That is available on there as well. There's also a director's cut. Video versions of Mind Escape New Telos are available on YouTube and Spotify, and it's also available on all audio platforms like Apple and whatever other audio platform you use to listen to your podcasts. So please subscribe, like, and follow us, and we'd also appreciate any nice review.